And a pleasant good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is great to see each of you today. We've gathered once again to study from the scripture this morning. And today we'll be looking at the book of Exodus. In fact, we're wrapping up our study in Exodus today. We've got chapter 12 or lesson number 12 in our workbook, if you have the workbook. If you don't have the workbook, well, it's too late to get one now. We're on page 43. We've got just a couple of pages to go as we finish up our workbook, as we look at the tabernacle and the priest. We've been talking about this for the last 2 or 3 class sessions. There's really a great deal to learn from looking at the Jewish tabernacle in the Old Testament. Understanding, of course, that this was strictly a Jewish system. It's not part of the gospel system, but it did, in many respects, foreshadow the gospel system which was to come. You had the offering of the animal sacrifices at the tabernacle, which foreshadowed the offering of the body of Jesus Christ himself. You had various elements of the tabernacle worship that, again, were a shadow of what was to come under Christ. So we'll see some of that in our study today. It's good to see each of you this morning. Hope you've had a pleasant weekend. And as we begin our class this morning, I'm going to ask Brother Clarence, if you would, to lead us in a prayer. Can we bow, please? And thank you, Brother Clarence. And I appreciate Clarence giving thanks for the freedom that we enjoy in America, freedom to gather as we have. And yet sometimes there are people who would interrupt or take away that freedom, as we saw this weekend at a shooting in Pittsburgh, and a Jewish congregation. I believe as many as 11 were murdered by anti-Semite men. Very tragic. We need to appreciate the liberty that we have, yet at the same time condemn those kind of actions with respect to those who would take away religious liberty and religious freedom. Well, as we look at the tabernacle and its furnishings, we've been talking about the tabernacle, the courtyard itself. This was the tabernacle courtyard. You had these curtains that went all the way around the tabernacle area. Inside the tabernacle courtyard, you had first the altar where animals were sacrificed right here. And then between this and the tabernacle proper was the laver. This is where the priest would wash before he would go in to minister. And then the tabernacle was actually a relatively small area. It was about 45 feet in length and about 15 feet wide and 15 feet high. It was divided into 2 compartments. The outer or larger compartment, of course, the tent, the curtains are taken away here, so you could see what it would look like inside. What was the outer compartment called? The outer part of it was called the holy place or the sanctuary. And then the second part, which was back here, which was separated by a curtain, that was called what? The most holy place, holy of holies, or the holiest of all. That's just some of the terminology that you see in the scriptures. This is where the high priest went once in the course of the year to offer an atonement, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. We are on page 43 and looking at the top of the page where it says the tabernacle and its furnishings. And let's just go down the page and let's see if we can identify these furnishings of the tabernacle and what part they might have played in the worship of the Jewish people. Question 15, that's our first question for today. What was placed inside the ark? That's the ark of the what? Ark of the Covenant, or sometimes called the Ark of Testimony. Yeah, what was placed inside? Yeah, it was the Ten Commandments, also a pot of manna, and also there was Aaron's rod that budded. And wasn't there something else that was mentioned in the book of Hebrews? I intended to look this up this morning. I was thinking about it, but did not do it. I was thinking there was something else that was in there in Hebrews chapter 9, and I would have to look at it in more detail. I can't recall where the verse was at the moment. Yeah, it's in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 4. Let me see, Hebrews 9. It gives Hebrews, of course, the purpose of the book of Hebrews is to show a contrast between the Old Testament law and the New, and that we are under a new and better covenant. And in doing that, the Hebrew writer often refers back to these things about the tabernacle, and he shows how that those things were foreshadowing what was to come under the gospel. But in doing that, he often goes into detail and gives us information that we would not have otherwise. Let me read just a few verses from Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9. It says, "Then indeed even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary." Ordinances of divine service meant service toward God. That was the purpose of this. It was service toward God by the Jewish people. This was their center of worship. And it calls it the earthly sanctuary in contrast to the heavenly sanctuary, the most holy place in heaven. Now I'm reading Hebrews 9:2. "For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part, in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail." Notice it mentions there the golden censer also being with the Ark of the Covenant. That's something you see here that I don't think you see back in the book of Exodus. At least it doesn't appear to be detailed in Exodus. Well, let's look at these items of furnishings. This is a representation of the ark and the mercy seat. And this was about, 4.5 feet in length. It was like a chest, might be the size of a small chest that you might have at the foot of your bed or something like that. What details do you see when you look at the Ark of the Covenant? What do you see here? Okay, you see the cherubim on the top. That part is called the mercy seat, the actual lid and the two cherubim. That's the mercy seat, and that's where the high priest would go and offer atonement for sin. On the Day of Atonement, he would go in and offer first an atonement for his own sin. In order for him to atone for the sins of the people, he had to atone for his own sins first. So he actually went in and offered that atonement for his own sins, and then a second atonement for the sins of the people. What else do you see here? Okay, you see the rings on the four corners. People were not to touch this. Even the men who moved it were not to touch it. They would use these staves. And what was the material that the staves were made from? These poles that were put through the four loops on the corner. What was the material? It was acacia wood and then covered with gold. The Ark of the Covenant itself was made of acacia wood, and then it was overlaid with gold within and without. There was a tremendous amount of gold used in this whole thing. Almost all of these furnishings inside the tabernacle were overlaid with gold. Now we've got some things outside the tabernacle that were of a different material, but that's where the tables of testimony, the Ten Commandments, were kept. And it's interesting that the ark actually has a history that is apart from the tabernacle. While it was kept in the tabernacle for how many years? From the time of Moses up to the time of Samuel, the ark was kept in the tabernacle, wherever the tabernacle happened to be. But on one occasion in the book of 1 Samuel, I think it's about chapter 7, the Philistines were at war with the Israelites, and the Philistines appeared to be winning. And the Israelite army said, you know, we need to maybe bring the Ark of the Covenant into our camp here, and that would mean God would be with us and we would be able to defeat the Philistines. And so we had a period of about 400 years from the time of Moses to the time of Samuel. I believe that's right, about 350 to 400 years. And does anybody know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant when it was brought to the camp of the Israelites? Anybody know? Mary Jane? Yeah, what happened? The Israelites continued to lose the battle even after they brought the Ark of the Covenant there. And the interesting thing is, when the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the camp of the Israelites gave a great shout. They were excited because we're going to win the battle now. And the Philistines were very much afraid when they heard this great shout. But the Philistines still won the battle. Why did God allow the Philistines to overrun the Israelites? Because they were worshiping idols. You cannot worship idols on the one hand and worship Jehovah God on the other hand. And what happened in this battle, the Philistines wind up taking the Ark of the Covenant away from the Israelites, and they take it home. They take it to the Philistine cities, and they went to the city of Ekron, then to another. I think they went to like 3 different Philistine cities, and everywhere they went, they had trouble. And they said, you know, we don't think we should have this thing. And so they put it on a cart, and there were some oxen that took it back to Israel. And it created more problems there because some of the men in Israel said, hey, let's open it up and look inside. And that wasn't a good idea. And the ark went to a place called Kirjath Jearim. It was kept there for maybe as much as 100 years. While the tabernacle was in a different location, the ark is over here, the Ark of the Covenant. So just a little bit about the history of the Ark of the Covenant. And there's much more that we could study on that. But in any case, this is where the 10 Commandments were kept. Now, were these 10 Commandments, the tables of stone, were they the original 2 tables of stone? No. What happened to the first set? Moses comes down, sees the people worshiping the golden calf, and that's when he breaks the 10 Commandments, okay, or breaks the tables of stone, not the 10 Commandments themselves. But there was a second set that was produced. Moses actually went and made 2 new tables of stone, and then God wrote the commandments on those tables of stone. Yes? It would have been heavy, that's right. David is pointing out that acacia wood is a dense, heavy wood, and then overlaid with gold. Gold is very heavy. And with the mercy seat on top and these 2 cherubim that were of gold, I don't know what it would have weighed, but it could have been a couple of 100 pounds or more. So it would have been heavy, but 4 men could easily handle it. And this was to be moved. When it went from point A to point B, 4 men could easily move it. It was the sons of Kohath. These were a group of the Levites. Remember, the Levites did all the work as far as putting the tabernacle up, taking it down. Remember, we mentioned last week that this whole system was portable. And I'm not sure how long it would have taken to set it up when they went from one place to another in the wilderness, to set it up and then to tear it down. Typically, things like this, it's much easier to tear them down than it is to set them up. But there was a uh, very detailed set of instructions as to how this was to be done in moving it from point A to point B. Now, the ones who did all this work were men out of the tribe of Levi, but particularly it was the sons of Kohath who were to do the moving. And so when the ark was put upon the shoulders of these four men, it would be four men out of that family of Kohath who were Levites. James? Okay, James is pointing out that those loops, the rings through which the staves were passed, might have been closer to the top rather than at the bottom. This would have made it top heavy like this. However it was, the sons of Kohath would move this from one point to another. In fact, so many of these things were made uh, like this, with the rings and the staves, so that they could be moved. And let's remember also, it wouldn't necessarily be four men who moved it. It could be eight men. You could have two men at each end of those staves. And so some of these items would have been heavier. And we'll see more about that when we look at some of the other items too. Well, okay. Question 16, what was it that was set on top of the ark according to Exodus 25? Well, that's the mercy seat with the cherubim. The ark was actually the chest itself. The mercy seat and cherubim was the covering for the top of it. What was the table of, this is question 17, what was the table of Exodus 25, verses 23 to 30? What was that table used for? The bread of presence, yes. It's sometimes called the showbread or the bread of presence. And a new set of this was put out each week. Notice how many loaves of bread, and we think of loaves as something like Wonder Bread or Sunbeam that comes in a loaf cellophane wrapper. That's just our modern what we have with a loaf of bread. These would have been flat cakes. How many of these were there? There were 12, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes is something that appears several times when we look at the tabernacle and all of its furnishing. But this was put out, fresh bread was put out each week. And the part of this, it's called the bread of presence. Why would it be called the bread of presence? Ideas, thoughts? Called the bread of presence, depending on what verse you're looking at. Also called showbread. The idea of the bread of presence is the idea that God is the provider. God is present with the people of Israel, and he is providing their daily bread. And while the other Israelites would not eat this bread, this was something that was reserved only for the priests. It still represented the fact that God is making provision for them. On one occasion, though, someone besides the priest did eat this bread. Do you remember when that was? It was David and some of his men who were in need of food, and this bread was already a week old, and so it was regarded, well, okay, its purpose has been served. We've got new bread to put out, so I guess David and his men could have them. And of course, King Saul, who was chasing David at the time, winds up killing those priests at Nob who gave this bread to David and to his men. But in any case, there's the table of showbread, and you can see again the staves. This would have been made out of acacia wood. The old King James Version calls it shittim wood, and acacia wood, and then it would have had the intricate mold or the casting around the top, the engraving work, and overlaid with gold. And how much would something like this have been worth just in gold? It would be a tremendous amount of money today. And I think I figured up one time how much gold was used in the building of Solomon's temple. And it was a tremendous amount of money. It wasn't just a few $1,000s. It was a very, very large amount. Well, the next question, uh, 18, what was the only source of light inside the tabernacle according to Exodus 25:31? Yeah, the oil lamp or the golden candlestick or the golden lampstand, the seven lamps, it's given different designations in different places. Uh, it's interesting that the lamp or lampstand or candlestick, however you might want to represent it, it again represents the presence of God. And remember in the book of Revelation, in the early chapters, when the Lord speaks to the seven churches of Asia, he says to the church at Ephesus, I want you to repent, or else I'm going to come and remove your lampstand. Remember that? The idea of the lampstand was the idea that God was present with his people. He was present with that church. But if they didn't shape up, God says, I'm going to withdraw my light from you. The idea of withdrawing the light meant that God would no longer recognize them as his people. Several times in the Old Testament, you have language where it speaks of the sun, moon, and stars being darkened. Remember seeing some of that language? Sun, moon, and stars. God says that about Assyria. He said that about Egypt. He said that about Babylon. It's the idea of the light of a nation being stuffed out, taken away. And so this candlestick not only provided light inside the tabernacle, an artificial source of light, it was to be lit every evening and all through the night. It not only provided an artificial source of light, but it also represented the presence of God being with his people. James? Yes. Hmm. Right, right. I think the censer is a shovel. It, I think the censer is, hmm. uh, I think the censer is a shovel that they used, a little small shovel that they used uh, to put the incense on the altar of incense. But I don't know. I don't really know any more about that. The golden censer is kind of a mystery there in Hebrews chapter 9. It really don't know that we really know any more about it. But uh, nonetheless, uh, yeah. Sorry. Well, there was a pot that held the manna inside the Ark of the Covenant. No, the censers were used. They were used to offer incense. Remember when Nadab and Abihu were killed in Leviticus chapter 10? Uh, they put strange fire on their censers when they were offering the incense at the altar of incense, and we'll see more about that altar of incense in a moment. Um, but in any case, the lampstand was there, and it did indeed represent the presence of God as well as providing some illumination. And remember that the inside of the tabernacle, these wooden planks that were made, I believe they were also overlaid with gold. And when Solomon built his temple, the walls of the tabernacle, the walls of the sanctuary, were overlaid with gold. And of course, remember that the sanctuary that Solomon built, the temple Solomon built, was built on the same scale as the tabernacle, except that it was just much larger. But the holy place was twice the size of the most holy place, but it was much, much larger under Solomon's temple. But still, the walls were lined with golden sheets. And so again, you see the tremendous amount of wealth that would have gone into the building of the tabernacle. I want us to look at question number 20. Question number 19. Describe the altar that is found in Exodus chapter 27. What was the size of this altar? And I think I've got a representation of the various parts of it here. And again, we've got staves that go through the rings on the four corners. What else would you say about this? What was the size of it? Yeah, it was 5 by 5 by 3 cubits, which would have made it 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet by 4.5 feet tall. So its height would have been about like so. That's about 4.5 feet, something like that. And the distance between these two pews is pretty close to 7 feet or so. So it wouldn't have been extremely large. But again, this was where the animal sacrifices were offered. And this also was made of acacia wood. Now, if it was made of acacia wood, why didn't it burn up? Because it was covered with bronze, okay? This was a bronze altar made of bronze. This was not overlaid with gold, but it was made of bronze, and the bronze would not. I'm sorry? By far the largest piece of equipment, and it would have been very heavy. And once again, you notice here, you've got rings on this grate that was used, and so you would have had more staves here to carry this. That's how it's represented in this drawing. But that's why I suggested a little while ago, you might have had 2 men on each of these corners on some of these things because of their size and because of their weight. Any other questions or observations, Clarence? You know, that's a great question. Okay. Clarence's question is, what do these different lamps represent? You've got the one in the middle, then 3 on either side. You've got a total of 7. They're variously called candlestick, though it wasn't candles. These were, God rested on the seventh day. I don't know. 7 is a perfect number in the scripture. And again, this may have represented God's presence. And I don't know that the scripture ever says there's 7 because. You know, when you've got the table of showbread and you look at that, okay, there are 12 because you've got 12 tribes of Israel. I don't know the reason why there were 7 of these oil lamps or 7 of these elements of the oil lamp. Don't have an answer for that. Anyone know? Phyllis, you have a question. Make it an easy one. They're asking me questions up there I don't have answers for. Mhm. Brass and bronze is just a difference in translation. Yeah. Yours says Shedem wood. Yeah, it's same wood. It's just a different word. Just a different word. You're using the King James Version. Almost all other translations use a different term. Acacia wood, as Brother David pointed out, is a very heavy and dense wood and resistant to worms, resistant to decay. Yeah, rotting, resistant to all that. So it's something that would have lasted a long, long time. And obviously it did. I mean, the Ark of the Covenant was still around 400 years later, and the Ark of the Covenant, being built around 1450 BC, lasted up to about the time of the Babylonian captivity, which is 800 years later. Would wood last 800 years? Of course it would. There's no reason for it not to, unless it's damaged by water or fire or insects or something like that. But the wood, yeah, so dense that water would not penetrate. Okay. You know, David is a woodworker, so he knows more about it than I do, certainly. Well, there was a smaller altar. There was a smaller altar that was to be placed inside the holy place. This is question number 20. What was the name of that altar? That's the altar of incense, okay? Remember the brazen altar was outside, but here is the altar of incense. This went right in front of the veil that separated the two parts of the tabernacle. Tabernacle, holy place is the larger part. That's where the priest went every day ministering morning and evening. And then there was the most holy place where that was entered into only on the Day of Atonement. But here was the golden altar of incense. And this is where the censer would have been used to light the fire or to burn the incense on that altar. That incense evidently represented the prayers of the people of God. In the book of Revelation, there is a text about the incense and the figurative use of incense indicating God's people praying to him and the prayers going up to God. This was something that was done. The altar of incense was used evidently every day, but it was also used particularly on the Day of Atonement. It played a role in that. And it would have been only a few feet away from this great veil, this curtain that separated the two parts of the sanctuary. And by the way, that when Solomon built his temple, and then later when the temple was rebuilt, then in the time of Jesus, that veil that separated the two parts of the temple would have been about 4 inches thick. It was woven material that would have been extremely dense, extremely heavy, and separated the two parts of the tabernacle or the temple. And by the way, when Jesus died, what happened to that veil that separated the two parts of the temple? It was torn in two from which direction? Top to bottom. It was torn from top to bottom, indicating that no human hand touched that. Yes, sister? Revelation 1:20. Yes. Here's a reference to 7 lampstands, and each of the churches had their own lampstand. Not literally. They didn't literally each have a lampstand uh, in the sense that there's one in every congregation, but it's the idea of the representation of God's presence. This is Revelation chapter 1, verse 20. The mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. The 7 lampstands which you saw are the 7 churches. That's the reference to the 7 churches of Asia. That would be the church at Ephesus, church at Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, and so on. And each of these churches is represented by a lampstand, representing the presence of God's people, or the presence of God with his people. However, with respect to the church at Ephesus, if you look at Revelation 2:5, he said, "Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent and do the first works, or else I will come to you quickly, and I will remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent." Now, this is all the figurative use of lampstand. This is not literal. There were not literal lampstands. But he said, and he indicated that these lampstands were representative of something. They represented God's presence. And when the lampstand or the light is being taken away, God's presence is no longer with these people. That's the idea. Again, a figurative use of lampstand, whereas here in the tabernacle, they literally did have a lampstand. Yes, sir. On the golden altar of incense? Oh, yes. this would have been, it's like burning incense in a tray. Yeah, it was just the melting of incense. That's all it was. Gold melts at a very low temperature compared to brass or bronze, which would take a very high temperature. That's why the altar of sacrifice that was out in front of all this, it was made of bronze. Well, we need to wrap up. We've got a few more things we need to look at very quickly. Question 21, what allowed the priests to be clean when they ministered in the tabernacle according to Exodus 30? Okay, you've got the laver, and the priests would wash their hands and wash their feet at the laver before they would go into the tabernacle to minister. And remember this incense, there were actually two things. There was anointing oil, and there was incense. And what restrictions were put on the people? This is question 22. What restrictions were put on the people? Yeah, there was a special formula for both of these, and the people were not to duplicate it. This was to be regarded as holy, and it was not for common use. Okay, at the bottom of page 43, we've got the priest, and I want us to look at that. Here's a representation of the priest, of the high priest, and there are several elements of his garb, and all of these elements had some purpose, had some symbolic meaning. When we look at the turban, which was on his head, there are actually two things on his head. There is the linen turban itself, which is like a hat, and then if you note carefully, there's a plaque here at the front of that turban, and that said holiness to the Lord. It represented the fact that this man was to deal with sin problems of the people, and he was to be holy so that the people could be holy. As we go further on this, we have the shoulder pieces, one on either shoulder, and these shoulder pieces were to have the names of the 12 tribes. There's that number 12 again, beginning in order from the oldest to the youngest, and their names, 6 were to be on one of these shoulder pieces, 6 names on the other. So you're going to have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, and then 6 on the other. Looking further at this, we have what's called the breastplate of judgment. This would have been about 9 or 10 inches square, something like that. The breastplate of judgment had 12 stones, 1 stone for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then inside this breastplate of judgment was something else. Anybody care to say the name of what was in there? There were actually 2 things. There were the Urim and Thummim. Thummim is a strange sounding word. Well, they both are. But these, and we don't know exactly what these look like and what size they were. They would have been small enough to fit in the back of this, and they evidently would have been of approximately the same in appearance, with the exception that they may have been different colors. But these were used for judgment. This is called the breastplate of judgment because sometimes questions were answered by God via this Urim and Thummim. And so a question would be posed to the high priest, is it this or that? And so he would reach in and pull out one of these and would answer a question. We go further. As you look at his garb, there was a sash that was worn around his waist. That was kind of like a belt, but the sash around his waist, and then that would be wrapped around the ephod. You see that is a common terminology that is used of the priest's garb in numerous places in the Old Testament. The ephod, and then you had the robe, which was blue in color, and what was on the bottom of this robe? You had bells and little representations of pomegranates, I believe, on the bottom of this robe. And so when the high priest went into the most holy place, we mentioned that the other evening, when he went in to minister in the most holy place, they could hear him moving in there. The bells would tinkle, okay? So you had the robe, and then you had a linen tunic that was underneath the robe. So you actually had 3 layers here, the ephod, the robe, and the tunic. And then, of course, the priest also wore undergarments. And the undergarments would have been important for sometime later when the temple was built and the priests would ascend the steps of the temple, and so that would be strictly for modesty's sake. And so this is probably a pretty fair representation of what the priest's garb would have looked like. Any questions or observations on that? All right, let's go to our final page. A final page, and that's page 44. Question 24 at the top of the page. Why do you think the priests wore stones with the names of the 12 sons of Israel on them? Why would that have been there? Yeah, as a reminder that he was serving the 12 tribes. And the 12 tribes were God's holy people. And what was to be engraved on that golden plate that was attached to the high priest's headdress? Holy to the Lord, holiness to the Lord. And now, at question 26 on page 43, how were the priests to be consecrated? And actually, it's a very complex thing. In chapter 29, it goes on and on. There was a bull that was sacrificed, 2 rams. He was to put on his dress. He was to be anointed with oil. His sons were anointed with oil. They too would be dressed. The bull was to be killed and burned as a sin offering. And then you kill one ram, burn it on the altar, then kill the other ram, put the blood on the right ears, the right thumbs, and the right big toe of the priest, and then blood on the garments. All of this sanctified by blood. And the priest, the book of Hebrews has a great deal to say about that, but it said that almost all things according to the law were sanctified by blood. And so the blood of an animal was literally put on the high priest's right ear, right thumb, and right foot. And as to the symbolism, obviously, there's some symbolism connected with that. And it might be that the priest is to hear from God. He's to listen to God's instruction, and he is to serve God with his body, hand and feet. He is to serve God. All of this was part of consecrating him and setting him apart, saying that this priesthood is special. Now, obviously, when we talk about the Old Testament priesthood, we're not talking about anything relative to modern priesthood that you might see in the Mormon church or the Catholic church or some other kind of priesthood. Nothing like that. This was strictly Jewish. It was a Jewish priesthood, and these men were to minister to God in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. The true terms tabernacle and temple both refer to the place where the service of God was to be done. Tabernacle first for about 400 years, or a little more than that, until the time of King Solomon. King Solomon built the great temple in Jerusalem. The temple served the same purpose as the tabernacle, except the temple was permanent, while the tabernacle was not. The tabernacle was actually in several different places. Look at question 27, middle of page 44. What offerings were the priests to offer regularly in the tent of meeting, allowing God to dwell with his people? There were to be 2 lambs that were offered, one in the morning, one in the evening. That was to be done every day. And so sometimes you'll see language even in the New Testament. It was the time of the evening sacrifice, something like that. Well, there was a sacrifice in the morning, sacrifice in the evening. And of course, in addition to that, and there's much more of this in the book of Leviticus, there were sacrifices that were made on special days throughout the year, but there was this daily sacrifice in the morning and evening every day. The final part I want us to look at is on page 44, where the tabernacle is erected. How did Moses and the people build the tabernacle according to Exodus 39? They built it according to the pattern that the Lord commanded. And remember, so much of this is recounted for us in the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 8 and verses 5 and 6, I believe it is. Listen to this. As it speaks of these things regarding the law, the tabernacle, it says in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, these things serve the copy and the shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, this is God speaking, See that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. And so while Moses was on the mountain, all this was revealed to him by God. And it was all according to a pattern. And these things were foreshadowing what was to come. Now think about this, folks. If these things under the law were to be made according to a pattern, and they foreshadow what was to come, what was to come must also be according to a pattern, right? Because you couldn't have a pattern back here foreshadowing something later that had no pattern. See, sometimes people say, well, there's no pattern for things in the New Testament. You know, it's every man for himself. We do whatever we want to do. No, that's not right. These things were foreshadowing what was to come under Christ. Christ who established a better covenant, established on better promises. Question number 29. When was the tabernacle erected according to Exodus chapter 40? Okay, first, when is it? Yeah, and it took about, I think if we count the time, I think it took about 7 months to build all this and put this together. By the way, I found something interesting as I was studying this week. Remember, the tabernacle was to have several coverings. So let me see if I can find a picture that would show some of those coverings. I don't know if I've got that. Anyway, there were several coverings on the tabernacle itself, okay? Several coverings. And one of those coverings, my translation says badger skins. And if you look at chapter 25, I think, look at chapter 25 and verse 5. What does your translation say? As it talks about these different coverings, and it talks about the material that was needed, and says ram skins dyed red, badger skins, and acacia wood. These were things that were needed for the building of the tabernacle. Does anyone have different language than badger skins in chapter 25, verse 5? Dolphin. Dolphin. Think about that. Think about that. Where would they get dolphin skin? They would have brought them from Egypt, that's right. There at Mount Sinai, there are no dolphins right there at Mount Sinai, okay? They did have the Red Sea not far away and the Gulf of Suez and the like of that. But I just found that interesting that they, and most translations, modern translations say that, or they were either dolphin skin or seal skins. Dolphin skin, though, is probably the preferred reference. Yes. Yes, the pattern for the lamps was given on Mount Sinai to Moses. That's right. In fact, all of these things were according to a pattern. Uh, the Jews didn't just do this according on their own, but they were given specific instructions as to what was to be done. I want you to look at, let me see, question number 30 on page 44. Ooh, are we out of time? We've got 1 minute, they say. Well, what happened when Moses erected the tabernacle? What was it that filled the tabernacle? It was the glory of the Lord. And I guess that brings us to the end. We're completely out of time. I hope that we've appreciated this study that we've had in the book of Exodus. We're now wrapping it up next Sunday. Is that correct? Is it next Sunday? Yes, which would be the 4th. The new study will begin here in the auditorium, which will be Leviticus and Numbers. Brother Greg, along with Brother Ulysses, will be teaching that class. I'll be teaching a Bible reading class on the book of Matthew, and there'll also be a third class for men only, Tender Warrior. And if you're concerned about your man or your boys being men, get them in that class. Brother Terry and Brother David Rogers scheduled to teach that, and we're not sure that David will be back for that. But Brother Terry is well versed in that material. It'd be a great class just for men only. Well, that wraps it up. Thank you all for being a part of this for the past 3 months. I hope you've learned a little bit about the Lord and about his glory and about how these things foreshadow the New Testament church. May the Lord bless us all. Thank you.